find that in the undergrad, it's almost just as hard to simplify it as it is. So it's almost like, you know, I'm not very flexible in my registers, you know. Is that elegant or
I know.
wash?
That's true.
Actually,
Actually,
your
there
own
is,
personal tutor.
that's true. There is one person
You
who,
don't need the credits.
I don't need
They're
credits.
just basically selling credits.
That and also
Okay.
their, the board.
So we can start?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming today. We have Marina Peters-Newell here with us, who is the language coordinator for the lower level courses in the foreign language and literatures department. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. And actually, I know everybody, and I now know Marina as well. So, I really like talking about language acquisition, and this is a great forum because I have definite ideas about language acquisition, and I get to vent them here, and I get to, you know, have you as an attentive audience to listen to me. And, you know, if you have questions, you can certainly ask them at any point, but I think that there will be some time afterwards for a Q&A, and so, you know, you should feel free to ask questions, disagree, you know, whatever. You wouldn't dare. You might. Okay, so my topic is making language acquisition happen. You know, when family invited me to talk, I thought, well, I could do, you know, online language acquisition. I could do hybrid classes. I could do, you know, just talking about sort of the theory behind it all. But then I thought, I think what most people would be interested in is just the concept of language acquisition itself. So I'm kind of trying to do this head-on. In a way to make it more interesting, but in a way also to make it more controversial, so that you know, you can look at the thing head on. But having said that, I'm also going to borrow from the early scholastics methods. The pseudo-Dionysius uses the apophatic theology to get at you know, what God is. So I'm not going to be talking about God, but I'm going to be starting at least by talking about what language acquisition is by means of what it is not. Right? So negative theology. So, okay. Okay, so how does language acquisition happen? Most of us have textbooks. If you've learned another language outside of the one that, you know, you spoke as a first language, if you learn the language institutionally, you probably use a textbook. So textbooks, we have to assume that the authors have spent quite a bit of time trying to determine an ideal order in which language ought to be learned. So that order, you know, usually, although there are exceptions, usually begins with a present tense. And then they will add a future tense somewhere down the road. By 102, we get to those notorious past tenses, and we sprinkle in adverbs and all kinds of things all the way through. But I think we can question the order in which language is learned. And I think we should question the order in which language is learned. So whether or not that textbook order is ideal is something that, you know, we are going to be talking about. And I will get to that later in the talk, but for the moment, I would really, I'm just going to be offering some general assumptions about language acquisition that I hope, you know, in some ways to debunk for you. All right, so let's see if I can figure it out. So the second question is, how do we know it's happening? And this, of course, involves keep you on your toes. Assessment. Yes, thank you very much. Because we really don't know if it's happening unless we assess. And, you know, I have given workshops on assessments, and they're usually like 8 hours in length, so I'm not going to be doing that. But I may be getting just sort of to the tip of the iceberg. on assessments. All right, so there are some problematical equations in the whole sense of language acquisition, or as I indicated on the flyer, dissonances. And the first one is teaching equals learning. So this is not exclusive to language. This is, across the board. And the assumption here is that if we explain something really well, students will get it, learn it. And if they don't, what's the problem?
Them.
Right, they're lazy, or maybe they're just idiots, or maybe the explanation wasn't as good as it could have been. So what do? We don't sleep that night, but in addition to that, we spend a lot of time improving our explanation. Right? We bring in more visuals, we underline things, emphasize things, take out any peripheral things that might have been confusing, bend over backwards, basically, to improve the explanations. The problem with the notion is that is the basic assumption that explanations actually lead to learning, and they seldom do. That's the problem. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with this little cartoon. Can everybody read it? Yeah, is it big enough? So it's the two boys and the dog. I taught Strike how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. Right? So I can imagine that the boys' whistling demonstration and explanation was probably pretty good. But it simply means that you can consider yourself an excellent teacher. But if your students aren't succeeding, then you have to ask yourself some important questions. Maybe, not just asking these questions of your students or your dogs, but also of your teaching methods. Okay? So I really do think that not everybody quite understands the concept that teaching does not equal learning. I really think it's a radical sort of disconnect or dissonance that's really hard to wrap your head around. Almost as radical as the Copernican revolution. It's the whole sense that, oh, you mean the universe doesn't revolve around earthlings? Oh, you mean the classroom doesn't revolve around the teacher? It's a disconnect. It's a major shift in perspective. Research has shown that in a typical classroom, 70% is teacher talk. So, if you look at that whole sort of geocentric universe, ours tends to be a very teacher-centric universe. And we tend to be okay with that. And why is that? Because of the Atlas. So who is Atlas? Teacher. All of us. Anybody know who Atlas was? Why we borrow Atlas? A Greek god. We are all gods, are we not, as teachers? Do you sometimes consider yourself as God because we stand up here and impart divine information to our students who then gobble it up? And it tends to be a pretty satisfactory equation simply because the onus is on you as a teacher, right? You are the one who's bearing the world on your shoulders, who tends to take all of the responsibility. So the emphasis is definitely and distinctly on teaching as opposed to learning. And the students who are sitting there looking at you, either wide-eyed or with their eyes closed, really don't want the emphasis shifted onto them. So they prefer it that way. So just because the equation works in your classroom and everybody seems to be very happy doesn't mean that it's a productive classroom, right? So I'm here also sort of to debunk this Atlas complex and to hopefully degrade us as teachers, since all of us here are teachers, in fact, to a different kind of status. You are gods in your own right, just not in this one. Okay, the other problematical equation is that achievement equals proficiency. And let's first just define these terms. What is achievement? Does anybody know as opposed to proficiency?
Is it learning the things that were taught? In other words,
Yes.
picking up, doing well on the tests?
Yeah, and there are differences in tests, because you can have a proficiency test and an achievement test. But yes, in the sense of discrete pieces of information, we would call grammar structures, vocabulary items, that sort of thing. So it's learning and demonstrating a discrete skill, essentially. And those discrete skills might be verb conjugation, noun declension, adjective agreement, right? All of those things, okay? And how, in fact, are students going to demonstrate this? That's the achievement test, right? It's the achievement test, which is, conjugate this verb, decline this noun, add the agreement, very simply. You've got here multiple choice, right? It's almost as simple as that. It's fill in the blank, add the agreement, just this really basic stuff, okay? I know this little dude looks totally frustrated, but I happen to like achievement tests. When I was learning languages, I'm a real grammar guru. I did very, very well on achievement tests. It's a good thing nobody ever gave me a proficiency test, because I would have failed that outright. So, some of your students love to do this kind of stuff. In fact, they will, rebel if they don't get this stuff. And those are the students I get in my office. But, yes?
I have a question about placement tests. Are we testing for achievement, or are we testing for proficiency?
That depends on the placement test. If you're talking about the French placement test, that's a whole different story. But if you're talking about the Spanish and the German placement test, they are multiple choice, but they are both flexible enough, since they were all written by experts, people with budgets and stuff. They actually work with the student abilities. So the questions will become more challenging as they go on. Or they will, reduce the sort of level if they find that the student is not succeeding. So I find that, both the Spanish and the German placement tests, which are professionally made, are relatively good, because we are looking at proficiencies, which I'm going to be talking about next, understanding written word, texts, reactions to texts, that sort of thing. It's not just black and white. So I think placement exams have come a long way, except for the French one. So proficiency, is the other side of the coin. Basically, we're looking here at the 4 skills, what we've known all along for a very long time as the 4 skills, which are no longer, however, the 4 skills. We can't leave anything alone, because skills are, in fact, achievement, aren't they? Discrete. So it's sort of like looking at each of these skills discretely and saying, okay, one can be isolated from the other, when really what we're looking for is a whole language experience, much more holistic view of language. And so these 4 skills are now, does anyone know? Think of your IPA. 3 modes. So we start with interpretive, which is the passive interpreting either listening or reading comprehension. So it's reading or listening and understanding. Okay. The second one is interpersonal, which is, this is like a quiz for you, John. And you. Right, that's right, you do IPAs too. So the interpersonal is the interaction in the class, student to student, okay? It's spontaneous, improvised, right? It's true, authentic exchange of meaning, right? And then we have the presentational mode, which can be both written and oral. It can be a written essay, which is a presentation, it can be oral presentations, which we have, but it simply means that this language is reflected upon, it is rehearsed to some extent. There is the opportunity for polish, even though in some of our oral presentations we don't see that polish. But it's a different kind of beast, really. And so the transformation from 4 skills to 3 modes is precisely an attempt to work away from achievement and toward proficiency. A way of getting away simply from recall of rote, discrete items to the performance of language, which is what language is supposed to do. Okay? So this is something that comes through our ACTFL organization, which is the American Council for the Teachers of Foreign Languages. All right, so we have IPAs that some of you are familiar with, that I have the TAs creating and implementing in their classes in an effort to make the learning experience well-rounded. All of the aspects are involved in it. So you have all three of the modes, but you also have the 5 C's, which are considered to be sort of the Bible of the ACTFL guidelines. Does anybody know what those 5 C's are? This is a real quiz. Communication. Connections. Communities. 2 more. Culture. Connections.
Chocolate.
Chocolate. Chocolate goes in the middle.
Venn diagram.
So yeah, you did a good job of that. So basically, what ACTFL is trying to get at here is, once again, making sure that our courses are well-rounded. That language is not an end in itself, basically, because language never is. Because language is, in its very definition, a medium. It's a medium by which we explore something else, right? So all of our classes have to be considered as content classes or culture classes, because trying to learn a language, bereft of its context, bereft of its culture, I think is a travesty. So we can talk about Rosetta Stone, but we won't. So the culture issue, I have a little. Okay, so there's culture. Sorry, this is the first time using a clicker, so that's cool. Communication, I think, is, sous-entendu, completely understood here. We're looking for communication. I'm going to get back to communities, but the connections, what is that?
With other disciplines.
Exactly, it's with other disciplines. So the interdisciplinary nature of a language course, we could be covering anything from, obviously cultural studies, but history, literature, art, media studies. All of those are part and parcel of what a language class does, can do, has the potential of doing. Right? So that's an important link. Comparisons, this would be your comparisons to your own culture, of the target language culture, comparisons in time. It could be comparisons from one region in the target culture to another. So that's what they're looking for, so that students aren't looking simply at a series of dates or facts, but that they can identify with those, that they can then reflect upon those. And as far as I'm concerned, communities is the most important of these. It's again sort of double-edged, or has multiple directions, one of which is to get the students in a classroom beyond the classroom. So this would involve setting them up with partners around the world, which the last talk we had, Olga Balshamina was talking about how her Russian studies were able to hook up with Russian students, I think in Irkutsk, very interesting. I'm sorry? And send students to Chengdu. I mean, all of, whether it's study abroad programs or just have them, in the classroom but hooked up, which is, such an easy thing to do these days. But it's also community simply beyond the campus. So it could be the target speaking community within Albuquerque, right, or New Mexico. And lastly, and I think most importantly, I think it has to do with creating a community in your classroom, within your body of students. Not simply, a group of learners who are sitting in rows of desks, but a real, authentic community, which I've never seen one of our lower division classes not become a community. It's almost like there's no way it can't become a community, because we're using the language to communicate with one another. So they necessarily learn things and are curious about one another. This creates community, and it creates a classroom that students want to come to, where they actually find sort of lifelong friends. All of this is a part of what language can do. I don't think biology can do that. I don't think chemistry can do that. I don't think, there's a lot of subjects that can't do that. Language does that. Okay, so what is the relationship between achievement and proficiency? So achievement does not equal proficiency. It's not the same thing. But I would like to suggest that, it's actually quite right, that it doesn't necessarily lead to proficiency either. And this is the sort of controversial part about it. All right. So explicit grammar, this is what we would consider sort of the achievement aspect of it, is giving those discrete skills for students to be able to then, I can say learn, but memorize and then regurgitate by filling in a blank, that sort of thing. Right? So, I mean, it would be nice if we could have explicit grammar that goes into the brain and then out comes proficiency. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little. How many of you don't do French at all? Actually, no French. No. Okay. Or you do a little French. You know some French. Daniel, how's your French? Okay. So I'm just going to quickly do this little grammar thing. It's the notorious preceding direct object thing. Imagine your students in a French class. And you hear le participe passé employé avec avoir s'accorde avec le complément d'objet direct quand celui-ci est antéposé au verbe, le complément d'objet direct est postposé au verbe, le participe passé invariable, le complément d'objet direct, etc., etc. So what are you hearing as a French student? As somebody who doesn't actually know this rule, right? You have to pretend a little bit. What are you hearing?
Lots of language.
Yeah, lots of, right, consonants and vowels and... Are you putting things together? This is my little skeleton with the conjugation thing, but are things coming together the way me as a teacher, the way I would like it to come together? I don't think so. Okay, so this is, bear with me. I just want to give you a little. You probably know and have heard this already. It's the little teacher. Did it sound anything like that? I think so. I think it sounded exactly like that. Okay, so if it didn't get through in the target language, so then what should we do? Let's do it in English. The past participle agrees in gender and number with the preceding direct object, and when the reflexive takes an object, the past participle will agree with this object rather than the subject when it is preceding. Of course, right? So, as a student, I'm no longer in the target language. Everybody here speaks English. We're good to go, right? This is just as much wah, 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 wah as the French was. So, I mean, I think we all know this, that basically we are trying to get our students to use a medium of language, a target language. Well, if we do that by first giving them the grammar, right, that's taking them through a whole other medium, one that they are just as unfamiliar with, right? And if we do that in English, then, then you have to take them through yet another medium. And we really don't want our students to be learning Japanese or Spanish or Chinese through the medium of English. We want to get it to them directly, right? So my sense is this, and forgive my little, I'm just sort of experimenting with with PowerPoint and stuff you can do. But basically, as far as I'm concerned, grammar, you're hitting their head against a brick wall. English, once again, you're, taking them out of the whole context given them another brick wall, and they never get to the proficiency part. So, okay, once again, just bear with me. This is my dude, my talking head, and he is talking preceding direct objects. So, feds, dude, what are you trying to say? I'm not saying anything, I'm just trying to get my articles to agree with our past participles. This is not the kind of communication we're looking for. Right? Another example, I said I kind of had fun. I run, you run, you run, you run, they run. I agree. It doesn't work. Okay, so explicit grammar is not acquired, it's memorized. And where is it memorized? So I want to talk a little bit about brain. It's memorized in this place called short-term memory. And short-term memory disappears really fast in short term. Okay. Okay. I'm going to read a little bit because I haven't actually memorized this part. Back in the 1960s, experts assumed that all memories pass from a short-term to a long-term store after a short period of time. This model is referred to as the modal model. And some of you may know the name Richard Schifrin. He's the one who sort of explained this whole process, right? But this has been irrefutably disproven since. It's too bad, because I think we could work on that premise quite well, but it's not going to work. At best, explicit grammar can be a crutch that may ease the pain while the leg heals, but the crutch is not directly healing that leg. Make sense? Okay. Studies on how the brain functions, I think, are still very limited, but are extraordinarily insightful. We know, for example, that different senses are registered in different parts of the brain. When you're born, you have 100 billion neurons in your 3-pound universe. By the time you're 4 or 5, your fundamental cerebral architecture is basically complete. However, that's not bad news, because your neural networks continue to reorganize and reinforce themselves in response to new stimuli and learning experiences. This interaction stimulates brain cells to grow and connect through intricate branches of nerve fibers, otherwise known as dendrites. That's Latin for tree. So while the central trunk and the arterial branches of the dendrite calcify, or they lose their elasticity at a relatively young age, we can continue to grow twigs. And that's really important. Okay. All right, so the brain. Different places for different things, right? We've got the frontal lobe takes care of critical thinking, the temporal lobe, hearing. We have parietal lobe, senses, writing, calculation. Occipital lobe deals with images, right? So, I mean, different parts of the brain take care of different things. And we found out that if, you have some kind of trauma to that part of the brain, sometimes other parts of the brain can compensate and pick up for it. But not always, right? So we definitely have certain parts of the brain that seem to take care of very sort of discrete things or senses. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what happens in the short-term memory as opposed to what happens in the long-term memory. Short-term memory, and I'm going to ask you to recite this later, so listen carefully. Involves the firing of neurons which depletes the readily releasable pool, RRP, of neurotransmitter vesicles at presynaptic terminals. The pattern of depleted presynaptic terminals represents the long-term memory trace, and the depletion itself is the short-term memory. After the firing has slowed down, endocytosis causes short-term memory to decay. If the endocytosis is allowed to finish, that means the memory is not activated again, the pattern of exhausted postsynaptic terminals becomes invisible and the short-term memory disappears. But basically, what happens is the explicit grammar goes into the brain's short-term memory. Acquisition and proficiency are not located in that short-term memory, so it's almost like asking it to go from one file cabinet, miraculously, to another. That happens really well on computers, but it doesn't happen very well in the brain. It's not simply a matter of, ooh, I'm going to save it over here now. Let me memorize it, and now I'm going to save it in my long-term memory. It doesn't. The structures that decide what gets stored in long-term memory are located in the brain's emotional system. It's called the limbic system. Emotions are biological functions of the nervous system and strongly influence attention and memory. Environmental factors also influence brain development. For example, we know that fear inhibits learning. Don't scare your students. Low stress and high challenges through immersion and integration practices maximize brain activity. The brain grows new dendrites when stimulated with new experiences. So the ideal is an environment that stimulates and challenges, where the students' minds are actively involved, and what your students do determines the actual physical structure of their brains, how sophisticated their networks are. Well, I should say for us too, because we continue to grow twigs. So anything that captures the student's attention and gets their minds engaged has the potential to produce learning. And the more you change information from declarative to procedural, the better it will be stored in the long-term memory. So basically, we're looking at a learning sequence that starts with sort of sensory memory. The more you can give them meaningful and emotional hooks, the more students pay attention. That leads to working memory, which actually creates a stimulation of cell neurotransmitters, which leads to long-term memory, which is the messages that are sent productively, effectively with stimulation. So here's the short-term memory. Rote memory fires neurons, neurotransmitters are depleted, endocytosis, decay, short-term memory. Long-term memory, we start with the senses, meaning and emotion. It stimulates the neurotransmitters, and it does end up staying in the long-term memory. You still have to reactivate, right? It says, I think there's 47 repetitions before it actually becomes a part of your long-term memory. But with meaning attached, you can reduce that to 23. And I would say that, if it's even more meaningful, if you attach other things to it, for example, hands-on experience, actual procedural, physical experience, that you can reduce that even further. Okay. What happens to the brain on grammar? Neurotransmitter vesicles are depleted. Endocytosis. Okay, it's almost like a disease, right? But what I wanted to do in my PowerPoint was just, make it really physical. I want you to really think in terms of the brain as a piece of anatomy rather than just abstract. Okay. All right. So I have a little experiment. Simply tell us which of the following sentences is incorrect. My book is the one that Sarah stole. My book is the one Sarah stole. My cat is the one that scratched the sofa. My cat is the one that scratched the sofa. Which is incorrect?
4.
Why?
Because is the one, there's no relative pronoun. Is the one, so there's no relative pronoun between the one and scratched.
Yeah, but there's not in 2 either. So why not 2?
Is the one?
That's a very good.
Well, that's an Americanism. My book is the one Sarah stole. Okay. I'm sorry. Because there it's the object. My book
That's the
is
object.
Or is it
Yeah.
Irish?
We have really good defense mechanisms, but we just simply say, I don't know. Okay, so it just so happens that in English, you can delete that. When I have to read this, when it is an object of a verb in the embedded clause, but not when it is a subject. So I think, Sean, you were talking about it as an object, right? So, once again, we are mostly native English speakers, but not all of us. But we know when we have incorrect sentences in front of us, for the most part. But we're incapable of saying why. Okay? And it might be because, I didn't learn English through grammar. I didn't, come out of the womb and then my mom set me down and distinguished subjects from objects. Actually, that's the role of the father. But in any case, what's interesting here is that a lot of studies have been done in which you have control groups. So one control group, let's call it group A, will be fed nothing but explicit grammar throughout the semester. Control group B will be given no explicit grammar. It doesn't mean that they're not given grammar, it's just not explicit. It sounds almost perverse. But at the end of that semester, on a proficiency test, who is going to score better? Who's going to succeed more? The people with explicit grammar or without? I mean, basically the people who are not fed explicit grammar worked on proficiency, right? So you have group A doing achievement, group B doing proficiency. So who's going to score better on a proficiency assessment?
The people with bad
Probably
grammar.
group B, right? The people with grammar or
With
without?
bad grammar.
With bad grammar. I think you said with grammar. Yeah, okay. The people with bad grammar, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more successful because they have bad grammar, but it's possible that their grammar is not as good. However, the people in the achievement class, the ones that were fed the explicit grammar, proficiency simply is not there. They don't know how to do proficiency, okay? Oh yeah, come on. But now, when they were given a test whereby they had to identify structures, sentence structures that were incorrect, some of which were tied directly to the explicit grammar that Group A got over the course of the semester and that Group B got only implicitly, right? So they were given sort of standardized tests where they had to decide which sentences were incorrect. Group B, the ones that were not fed explicit grammar, right, did as well, if not better.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, okay, so you don't necessarily teach grammar, but what if someone is talking and they say something incorrectly and you correct them? Is that, I mean, it seems to me that would be more effective than
Yeah.
just teaching them remote. So you should
Exactly.
correct students?
No, I wouldn't call it correcting because you shouldn't, because you should be attending to what they're saying. So if they're communicating to you, you don't want to stop them and say, stop communicating, you need to look at form. But there are ways of doing that, and it's called recasting. So, you know, for example, you know, where's Dave? Oh, Dave in vacation. Oh, Dave's on vacation. You're communicating. It's a correction, but it's called recasting. And I think that it's very effective, simply because if you stop somebody midway through a presentation, or even just, you know, a comment like, what's your favorite film? You want to know what the favorite film is, not, you know, if they can use the verb to be correctly. Okay, so recasting tends to be pretty effective. Okay, so another small experiment. If you have, oh my God, get through this. If you have a little piece of paper and a pen, I'll do this as quickly as possible. You can do this, otherwise you don't have to, it's fine. Basically, it's a memory game, short-term memory thing. So number your page from 1 to 9. If you have a pen, you might have a paper, no pen. Number your page from 1 to 9. Okay. And I'm going to give you 15 seconds to look at the shapes on this page. And then I'm going to take the shapes away, and you simply need to, you know, see how much of that you can recall. All right, you ready? Okay. Oops. Oh yeah, that's the correct one. Okay, go. No, don't write anything.
Oh.
You have to recall. Don't write anything. Well, you have 7 more seconds.
In order?
Yeah, of course. Okay, all right. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but who thinks they got them all? Ashley? That's right, okay. Anybody else? Anywhere close?
Proficiency.
Ah.
Not one of my proficiencies.
Yeah, all right. Okay, well, I wouldn't call it a proficiency, but
There's no memory.
okay, so let's take a look. What do you think? Did you get them all right?
I missed one. Oh, wait, no, sorry, one little thought.
You got them. Wow, I wish I brought a prize along. I didn't expect anybody to get them. But I mean, you can definitely work on, short-term memory recall, right? When I was a high school student, I had sort of photographic memory, so I could recall things for like a biology test. I could see the page. I could see A, B, C. I don't do that anymore. But it's partly because what did I remember about that biology class? Nothing. But I sure passed the tests really well. It would have helped, I think, had you known that there was some rhyme or reason to this.
I saw there was rhyme.
Ah, what's the rhyme?
Well, they're backwards. Well, no, I took it.
No, there is.
There's a pattern
There's a
in
pattern.
terms of the backward L and the forward L and the upside down L and the backward upside.
There
or
it
the
is.
upside. But I guess they're the opposite, and then 5 is
Yes.
the middle.
Very nice. See, I mean, maybe not proficient, maybe you didn't get 100%, but at least you're, looking at things. Because, in fact, our mind seeks patterns, right? Our mind is trying to make sense of things. It's trying to, it's looking for meaning. It needs meaning.
But there are these proficiencies, and the reason I took one of these job assessment things, and it says that I did really well in matching up nonsense words with one another, which means I'm good at languages.
Right.
But with this kind of thing, I mean, I sort of saw a pattern, but I couldn't, visually,
Right.
I couldn't grasp it.
Right.
So there are different
There are
abilities.
competencies. Yeah, I totally agree. Yes, there are. And you can work at this. You can really, exercise your brain to be able to do these kinds of things. But in fact, it's a tic-tac-toe. So that's, what the series of shapes is. And I think if your mind had known this, you would have had no problem with that. So, I mean, my point is that, the Oxford English Dictionary has about 170,000 separate entries. How long would it take for you to learn 170,000 separate words in order to learn the English language? That is ridiculous. It's not even worth it to try to do that, okay? So disparate information needs to be put together in language. That's what language is. Language is not simply a word, right? Saussure has shown us it's just arbitrary sounds. St. Augustine told us that. Because if it were, it would just be a matter of, learning how to recall something. It's not that. It's so much more than that. But thank goodness it's not that. Okay. All right. So, I mentioned textbooks earlier on, and the textbook devises a kind of ideal instructional order. We tend to cover it the way it says we should cover it, or at least in the order that it's laid out. It's unlikely that we would try to teach a past tense before a present one, but there is something called an acquisition order, and this is the sequential acquisition of certain grammar features over time. The predictable order in which learners gain mastery over grammatical forms, right? The theory is that the order in which language is acquired is the same for each language learner, regardless of the textbook or the context. This is generally accepted for first language learners. There are more anomalies in the second language learner, but it is surprisingly true for the second language learners as well, right? So, does the instructional order equal acquisition order? Once again, it does not. We would really like it to, but it doesn't. An example of this is in learning English, regardless of what the language of origin is, and regardless also of whether the student is immersed in the culture, sitting in a classroom, or both, the third person singular S marker, right? That's the I sing, you sing, he sings, right? Is one of the first structures that's encountered. It's a present tense. It's, first thing in chapter 1, chapter 2, whatever, definitely before a past tense, right? But the acquisition order of it shows that it actually takes much longer to learn this, to acquire this, than the past tense. Go figure. So, what is the relationship between acquisition order and instructional order? Very little. The relationship is remarkably arbitrary. This begs the question of, are teachers necessary? So, is instruction necessary? Right? So, my answer is yes, they are. But insofar as the input needs to be highly structured and scaffolded for the student to learn. Essentially, if the teacher builds the environment effectively, students will come and inquire. If the student, if the teacher maintains his sort of atlas status, students will come and make no progress. But if the teacher actually builds and creates an environment that is productive, the students can come take advantage of that, and acquisition will happen. There's a huge disconnect between the two. All right, let's see. It also, shows us that just because we cover it doesn't mean they acquire it. So, we tend to expect students, we're going to give them a certain number of discrete points, and by halfway through the semester, boy, they better have it, because otherwise they fail. That's not acquisition either, right? Acquisition order is its own beast. It's its own mechanism that the brain determines, and it's a collective mechanism. It's not particular to one brain. Very interesting. So I think we should probably work with that rather than try to work against it. All right. Are we looking for proficiency or achievement? And I think it's pretty clear that we're looking for proficiency. Achievement, definitely in a linguistics class. Achievement for other purposes as well. But in lower division languages, we are clearly looking for them to be able to apply language. And that's where Bloom's, cognitive taxonomy comes in handy, because the remembering, that's achievement. That's rote memorization. But it's all the rest of it that's important for proficiency. Understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. And the interesting thing about this is that, it's kind of the horse and cart thing. We think that they need to memorize or somehow retain discrete vocabulary items, structures, whatnot, in order to get to the point of doing the rest of these higher order skills, when in fact it's the opposite. If you can get them to apply and analyze, reflect, and create, then ironically, they will remember. All right, so if teaching does not equal learning, and achievement does not equal proficiency, this is obvious. We need to de-emphasize teaching, emphasize learning. We need to de-emphasize achievement, emphasize proficiency. Learning plus proficiency equals language acquisition. Wow. All right, so here's finally, and how do we get to learning and proficiency? I know I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to go through these quicker than I would otherwise have done. But comprehensible input is absolutely necessary. You can't have output without input. So the teacher is going to create that environment where students will be communicating using targeted grammar structures, but attending first and foremost to semantics, not syntax, right? To the meaning, not form. Right? And if we only have 3 50-minute class, contact sessions per week, we'd better use that for acquisition. Okay? The second is meaning. Everything has to be attached to meaning. You cannot do form without meaning, because then basically you're sending acquisition out the window again. You're wasting time. Physical. And here again, I was going to, do my little experiment, but I don't think I have time for that. But very, very important not to keep all of your students in their seats during the entire time. In fact, if you go to any one of our language classes, Yuki, Chang, how much of the time do your students sit in one seat? Not very much. Right? They're constantly up, talking to each other, changing groups, mingling, they're doing all kinds of things. And, those of you who were sleeping through the first part of, I could have got you up and you would have awakened. So that's always a good thing. But you really want to give them that authentic opportunity to communicate. That's how you create a community. Culture, it's culture at the core. Our classes are content-based. You use the language as the medium. And again, I'm going through this really rapidly. Student-centered, so not the Atlas complex. You need to make the students the ones who are, responsible for their own acquisition. So that means that, if I'm going to do some kind of warm-up and ask you each a question before the class begins, I'm wasting my time and your time, because if there's 10 people in here and you get to talk for 30 seconds, that means that, in a period of 10 minutes, you are speaking all of, 5% of the time? That's not good enough. Students need to be interacting, using the language, not practicing the language. They're not practicing anything. They're using it for authentic purposes. I would say at least 70% of that class time. Objectives have to be very clear at the outset. Students and you need to know what they are supposed to be accomplishing in those 50 minutes. And then, of course, assessment. You need to know that that is being accomplished. And I have about 7 hours of slides on assessment. I was going to do assessment simplified, but I think that we're running out of time, and I prefer not to jump in there, because that would take at least another 15 minutes. But that's my presentation. I know I brought up some things that are maybe not everyone agrees with, but it doesn't necessarily, I'm not looking for everyone to suddenly change the way they teach, but I do hope that the insights will give you a better understanding of what you are or are not accomplishing in your classroom. That's my hope. Anyway, thank you. Questions?
I have a question, Marina, very quickly. What you refer to as Bloom's taxonomy, which I believe was in the form of a triangle.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether that was intended in some kind of hierarchical order, where remembering would come first, and then understanding, and at the top of that triangle, you would have creating, or right?
I think, yes.
So at the apex you have creating, and at the base you have remembering. It's just that what's interesting is that remembering is the base. I mean, if that's how Bloom intended it.
Right.
And then you go towards creating, right?
Right.
Then in a sense there are certain baby discrete blocks maybe that we do need to play around with in order to get to that very complex freedom of creativity, right? That in a sense, I mean, language may very well be like math. You start with a few fundamental axioms, and then you just multiply them, combine them in a myriad of ways to be original. But there has to be some sort of structure at the core that allows you to play in infinite ways.
Right.
So first the question is, is this intended as some kind of a meaningful hierarchy, or would it be better to symbolize it in the form of several Venn diagrams?
It is very well maybe possible. I think that people have taken Bloom's taxonomy and changed it up in a number of different ways. But it is intended as a kind of hierarchy in the sense of higher order thinking. I don't know if Bloom intended it to mean that at the base of the pyramid you need to start with this. But I would differ about the math. I think that math can be acquired much better along the lines of language acquisition. But if that is the case, if this is a hierarchy and that you are intimating that we should start with those sort of mini structures, as Bloom is maybe suggesting here, then I would differ, because basically what I'm saying is that if you don't do the remembering part, if you start with understanding and applying, then by the time you get them working with it, almost miraculously, they will remember those pieces better. And it's not a matter of not giving them those individual structures. You give it to them, absolutely, but you do it implicitly.
Okay. Two very, very quick responses. I am not intimating that should be the base, but I was asking whether Bloom sort of intended that to be the base. And second, I completely agree. I think math is that very skill that works very much in the language, and that the two go together. But I guess one of the most interesting talks that I also listened to was by a linguist who says that what makes human beings very efficient language learners is also the fact that they don't just do it inductively, right? That that in a sense, adult learners are also very efficient learners. Somebody who can be thrown to a language at age 14 can become fairly proficient. And we do that, and we do not take 14 years to sort of acquire very quick proficiency in something, because we learn both inductively and deductively.
Right.
So that,
Well, we learn to learn deductively. I would say that we learn innately inductively. I mean, our first language, we don't do deductively.
sure, but then what makes second language acquisition, and that's what we're talking about right now, is the fact that deduction is also important. So I guess I'm not ready to throw the grammar baby out of the bathwater, only because, you think that something like gender in French is so minor. Le livre or la livre, right? But once, like a French friend said, when you mess up on that gender, it's very difficult to sort of understand. It throws the syntax of the sentence completely off for me.
But I would say, again, that it's not a matter of memorizing le livre or la livre. It's a matter of using it to the point where it's absorbed. I have not learned, how many words are there in the French language? I have not memorized every one of them. I simply use them and reuse them until they're completely there. So I would say there again that it's really not a matter of trying to tap into something that has happened, something that has been trained into us through, our education system, which is that deductive learning. Language is already there. Language, we have, a brain that's already set up for it. Why not tap into that?
Right, but I think.
Sorry, we have to end because there's another class. Well, it's too bad we can have longer because it's an interesting conversation.
Right, I knew, and that's why I brought it up.
Yeah.
That's why I did it.
Thank you so much, Marina.
Have you turned it off yet?